So my skeptical mind, and that's just who I am, my skeptical mind goes to, well, yeah, of course, you've got this guy over here that's logical and reasonable, and you got this guy over here that's wearing a tinfoil hat. Of course the tinfoil hat guy's going to see a lot of stuff, right? He's like imagining it, or he's watched one too many sci-fi movies.
But it's used to help us frame hypotheses for UFO propulsion, power, stealth, weaponry.
Everything that we experience is very positive.
Sometimes the field of ufology has a short memory span.
We didn't know anything about the $22 million back then. We just kind of thought, well, this is, and I think that was the reason why they were looking for military.
Well, all right, good evening, everyone. I just sometimes have to let that intro roll a little bit longer because it basically cracks me up. I love hearing the quotes from people and the little animal sound effects. It just makes me happy. I hope that you've all had a wonderful week. I am here in Salt Lake and it is almost 100 degrees, but it's absolutely beautiful outside. And of course, we've got all of this UFO news, the New York Times, Jeremy Corbell, Lou Elizondo, and from what I understand, we might be seeing a push to run for office from Lou Elizondo going against Cheney. So this is going to be interesting to see how the Bigelow boys kind of push their narrative with people, and obviously following some of these people on Twitter and seeing their dismay with some of the news is just quite stunning to me. But anyway, as you know, I am here every week to give you the truth, to try to get to the bottom of things. And sometimes it's pretty and sometimes it's funny. And, that's the way it rolls. Each week I bring on guests that I feel can help educate all of us. And I think that is really critical, especially right now when there is so much misinformation in the subject. This subject deserves to be taken seriously, and there are many people who have dedicated decades of their life to make sure history is preserved, to make sure that we understand and learn from history, and we have to do that. My guest this evening is one of those people. I've had a long standing respect for him. In fact, I think, he's one of those people that I used to respect so much and was maybe a little bit cynical, but I just and I was intimidated at first because I was the wide-eyed true believer, and he was somebody that really came at things with a very logical, grounded perspective, and I've learned a lot from watching him over the years. I am joined tonight with Mark O'Connell, who is a screenwriter, a teacher, a blogger. He actually wrote episodes for Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. He's developed feature film projects with major studios, including Walt Disney and DreamWorks Animation. He was founder of the UFO blog High Strangeness, which is so cool. You guys have to check that out. He lives in Wisconsin with his wife, Monica, and teaches screenwriting at DePaul University in Chicago. And I am so happy that we finally get to chat, because this is going to be a good one.
Well, thank you, Erica. That was really a very flattering introduction. I hope I can live up to all of that. And it's great to be here because we've been talking about doing this for a while now.
We have.
And I'm really glad that it's worked out for us to talk.
I am too, because I appreciate your logic in things. And I think you and I are both coming, from a place of, we understand that there's something very important to all of this, and then we see the madness and the mayhem taking place. And for me, this is definitely, there is a deliberate push to distract people from the truth of what people are trying to do.
Yeah, I agree. We're in the middle of strange times, that's for sure.
Well, and clearly there's not enough therapy and prescription medication to stop. I can't say enough Hail Mary. I don't know. It's been very interesting. But I want to talk a little bit for those of the people out there that don't know much about you, because you're really fascinating. But you originally you had a couple different choices. You were going to design cars, or you were going to go into screenwriting. And so tell us a little bit about that.
Boy, you have really done your research, Erica. I'm just floored. Yeah, I grew up crazy about cars, and I spent my entire childhood drawing cars. And when I wasn't drawing cars, I was watching science fiction shows on TV. So those are my two great loves. And I happened to I had an English teacher in high school, and one day he just kind of called me out and said, "O'Connell, what are you going to do with your life?" And I said, "Well, I'm either going to make movies or design cars." And he thought for a minute, and he said, "Make movies." So it was decided I would make movies. The funny punchline to that story is years later, that teacher and I kept in touch over the years. And a few years ago, he emailed me and he said, "Mark, help me. My son wants to be a screenwriter. How do I talk him out of it?" I swear to God. And I just wrote back and I said, "Well, you can't. So deal with it." So that's how it came to be. And, my career has taken some weird twists and turns. I should add, though, we're no longer in Wisconsin. I'm living in Atlanta now.
Oh.
Yeah. So that's been a big switch. We got here about 6 months ago.
Oh, that's cool. Do you like it?
So far, yeah. I mean, I might hate it a month from now when it gets really, really hot, but that's what air conditioning's for.
Yeah, it's gonna be muggy and things, but I hear Atlanta's a beautiful city, so maybe I'll have to come back and we'll visit, or you can come to Salt Lake and look through my archive. It's just so cool.
Oh,
I love it.
That was great.
I know, I love it. But tell me what kind of I'm really curious about cars, because I have a '65 Ford Galaxy.
You do?
Oh Lord! And I terrorize the neighborhood in that thing. I've mentioned before on the show, it's like, I don't know why I don't have curb feelers, and if somebody would like to give those to me as a donation for public safety, then I would appreciate it.
That is some heavy duty Detroit iron you're talking about. I love it. What color is it? And is it 2-door or 4-door?
It's 2-door, and it is canary yellow with leopard print interior.
Oh wow. That sounds fantastic.
It's a head turner.
Promise me you will never, ever, ever get rid of that car. That sounds amazing.
I won't. I mean, it's one of those. I've had it for 20 years, and I actually, when I first got it, I thought that I was going to be super cool, and I took an auto body class at the local college, and so I'm like, okay, this is so great. I'm going to sand off the paint, and it was full of Bondo, and then I took a plasma cutter to the rear quarter panel, and then I'm like, okay, this is not a good situation here, and so I hired a professional. And there you have it.
Yeah. You're blowing me away here, because that's been one of my life goals, and it'll probably end up being a retirement project. Is to buy an old car, take a welding class at the nearest technical college, and just go at it. Try to restore something. I think that's so cool.
Yeah, no, I love it, and I would love to really get. I mean, I would love, of course, a '69 Camaro. Would be super cool. I love the old Mercurys. That would be fun. But what kind of car? What would you like if you could have anything in your garage?
Well, I have a couple of imported cars on my list. One would be a Ford Capri, which was made in Germany, but it was sold in the U.S. in the early 1970s. It was sort of a follow-up to the Mustang, sort of a little baby brother to the Mustang. There's also, it's funny, I'm rambling now, a Volvo 1800, which is a very cool little Volvo sports car they made in the 60s and 70s.
Those are cool.
And as for American cars, my dream car, 1965 Buick Riviera. Most beautiful car ever made, in my opinion.
What color would you get?
I think some kind of GM always did a really good job with sort of an aqua blue color. I think that's what I would want for my Riviera.
That sounds nice. Well, I have my little fantasy garage, and one of these days maybe it can happen. But I need to get my little baby out and go to some car shows, which would be fun, because that whole community is so cool.
I know. It'll be so nice to go to car shows again. I can't wait.
That'll be good. But thank you for, and let me just ask you, what kind of music do you like while I'm at it? Not talking about UFOs.
My musical tastes are kind of all over the place. The last new artist I really got into was this woman named, Charlotte Adigéry. Not many people have ever heard of her. She's really quite awesome. We listen online to this public radio station out of Southern California, KCRW, and they play a lot of Charlotte Adigéry. We got turned on to her listening to that station. She's extremely weird, but extremely cool. And it's kind of indicative of my musical taste because I like weird, obscure old stuff. I listen to lounge music all the time.
Oh, yes.
I love movie soundtracks. Yeah, that's where I'm at. Huge fan of Burt Bacharach.
Oh, God, are you kidding me?
I'm
sorry, you just kind of like flipped my I'm okay. Old cars and Burt Bacharach. You just made me so happy because I was a jazz singer. I was a professional vocalist for 20 years. And so I got into, I started doing the band thing. I was classically training up at the University of Utah, and then I started doing the band thing when I was 18 and was in a reggae and a blues band and all of this stuff. But then it kind of moved over to jazz and blues. And, I had all the guys dressed up in their little 50s garb, and I was always wearing, just some elegant gown or something saucy. And I mean, we would play, Burt Bacharach was absolutely top on my list. And, Dionne Warwick, when she did some of his songs, it was just stunning. And The Look of Love is probably one of my favorite, songs to sing. And that was... My grandmother was a big fan of mine, and that was the last performance that she saw me do, and I dedicated that to her. So that was a really cool thing. I love Burt Bacharach.
That is a really sweet story, and that's a fantastic song.
And what's New Pussycat? Okay, I'm sorry to go like, okay, I need to get back to UFOs here.
No. Talking about Bacharach is always cool. Look of Love, that's from Casino Royale.
Yes,
right?
Casino Royale. That was
James
great
Bond's.
with Woody Allen and Peter Sellers. And yep. Oh, I love those days. That was.
We don't ever have to talk about UFOs. We're doing just fine here.
I like it. It's kind of a nice distraction, but that's great. I'm glad that we've got mutual interests.
You'll appreciate this. Last week, my two daughters drove down from Chicago to surprise me with a visit for my birthday, which was just really, really wonderful. And we all decided that we wanted to go out to karaoke. So a week ago, we live out in the suburbs of Atlanta, so we went into the city and we found this Korean karaoke place. And it was so much fun. And of course, there was a lot of Burt Bacharach stuff being sung, and it was the best night out I've had in a long, long time.
Well, that's awesome. You deserve it. And then there's nothing like karaoke. In fact, oh my Lord, I used to have a portable karaoke machine. I had nothing I should admit in public that's a little awkward. But sometimes you could just find me in the bedroom singing karaoke. Not really, but that's okay. But it's just fun. It's fun to see people getting up there and forgetting their inhibitions. And so I'm glad that you had a good time. That's awesome.
Yeah, it was very cool. And my daughters both have really beautiful singing voices. So, it just makes me happy to hear them sing anytime I get a chance.
How old are they?
The youngest is 24 and the older is, God, what is she? I think she's 32 now.
Wow.
And she's just about to get married in the fall. So, well, actually, she did get married in February. It was just sort of a low-key pandemic wedding. They're going to have a big party in the fall. So,
that's so fun. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, that's awesome. That is really cool. And so I want to ask, because you had, with your Star Trek, adventures and things. I mean, that was a really interesting story when I was listening to, a couple of your interviews too, because you were, you moved to LA. You were clearly having too much fun and you weren't focusing on screenwriting.
That's true.
And then you decided to go back home and then focus on that. But you made several attempts to get your screenplays submitted. And so tell us about that, because I again, that's a really cool story.
Well, there are kind of two parts to the story. There's the TV part and there's the feature film part. And in these days, the lines between those two have been very, very blurred. But back in the 80s and 90s, when I was first getting my start as a writer, they were very distinct art forms, TV and movie. So I got a break at Star Trek and was able to parlay that into a pretty nice freelancing career with them. I did one episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, and then 4 episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. One way or another, being credited different ways, story by, written by, etc. It was always kind of different with each episode. But then right when it would have been made sense for me to try to pursue a career in TV writing, which would have meant I absolutely had to move to LA. It was just not a good time with my personal life back in Wisconsin to pull up stakes and move the family out to LA. So at that point, it made sense for me to focus on movie scripts, because it doesn't matter where you live if you're writing movie scripts. So that's what I transitioned into, and I have one script in particular that almost got made a couple of times. It came very close to being set up at Disney at one point with the great Bill Paxton as director. It's still my favorite script. I think it's outside of my book, The Close Encounters Man. I think it's the best writing I've done in my career. So I'm very proud of that. I'm kind of rambling now. Feel free to.
No, I love it. I mean, this is so cool. I'm a big Star Trek fan, and people that listen to my show know that I've had a crush on William Shatner for really my whole life, and I went as low as to take my daughter to Comic-Con and try to stalk him there. But anyway, that's But did you? Well, he was kind of cute back 50, 60 years ago. And stuff, and if I could find the girdle that he wore in Star Trek, I'd be really happy about that. Yeah. But so, who did you meet? Did you meet any of the cast members?
Actually, no, I didn't, which was kind of disappointing, because I'm fairly certain that I am distantly related to Terry Farrell, who played Dax on Deep Space Nine. Because I have a lot of Farrells in my family, and our families both come from northeastern Iowa. So I'm pretty sure we're related in some way. The closest I came to meeting anyone on the cast was one of the times I was working at the Star Trek offices at Paramount Studios. I was looking for somebody, I don't know who, and I came barging into an office where I thought I would find them, and all these people in the room all looked up at me when I came in, and they were all just these really beautiful, good-looking people, all staring at me. And this one guy was standing up, and he said, "Oh, are you here for the rehearsal?" And I was like, no. And I left. And I realized the guy I had just talked to was Anson Williams, best known as Potsy Weber from Happy Days. He was there to direct an episode of Deep Space Nine. And if I hadn't been such a numbskull, I might have been able to get a part in the show. If I hadn't just turned around and left, because I was like, oh, I'm in the wrong place. I'm leaving. What a stupid move. I should have just said, oh, yes, that's what I'm here for. Give me a script.
I did not know Anson Williams directed.
Yeah. I think he's had a pretty decent career as a TV director. And, good for him.
Wow. Oh, that's so cool. I could just, I'm just gonna have to. You're gonna have to come back, and then we'll just talk about all of this stuff, and because I love it. I love hearing people's stories, and you've lived a really interesting life.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it. I did get to go on set once or twice. I did get to walk around on the promenade set for Deep Space Nine, and fiddle around with a shuttlecraft prop. Of course, you couldn't get into it, but it was kind of cool to just sort of stand next to a shuttlecraft.
Oh, that's so cool. And I have a question from one of my listeners, Peter, who wanted me to ask you, using your Star Trek examples, please explain your secret process for getting ideas and the first 3 steps.
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. For getting ideas, first of all, you have to just completely immerse yourself in the show. You have to know the characters inside and out. You have to know the universe in which the TV show takes place. You have to just have that completely nailed down. So those are the 2 big things, characters and settings. What the big surprise to me early on was I had written a spec script for Star Trek The Next Generation, and I just to plug my new podcast, Far-Fetched, I just did a dramatic reading of that script on my podcast recently. And so I submitted that script to Star Trek, and a couple months later, I heard back from them. They invited me in to pitch some story ideas, and they said, the reason we loved your script is because you really nailed the characters' voices. So that's like my number one advice to anyone who's interested in writing for TV. Know the show inside and out. Know how to write the characters' voices. What they were saying basically was, when we read your script, we could hear the characters speaking these lines because they were so right for the characters. So that's my big advice. I don't know if I know you asked for 3 steps. That's really just one step, but it's the big step.
Okay. That's cool. And that actually gives me some inspiration too. So thank you for answering that. And so now we're going to segue into your life in the UFO world. Why did you, I know, dun, dun, dun. So, so why did you become, what sparked your interest?
Well, I've been interested since I was a little kid. I've told this story many times. My mom, in 1963, I was 3 years old, and my mom watched the premiere episode of this new science fiction TV show called The Outer Limits. And the pilot episode had this terrifying creature that was sort of made of radioactive glowing light. And it's just scared the living crap out of me as a 3-year-old. I ran up. This is my first conscious memory. I ran upstairs and hid. And I told my mom I wouldn't come out until the monster went away. And instead of turning off the TV and comforting me, my mom just kept watching the show. And then, she told me when it was over, and then I came out of my hiding place and everything was fine. But that moment just sort of, it was a terrifying experience, but it got me interested. And ever since then, I've just been totally fascinated with aliens and monsters and science fiction and outer space and, all that stuff rolled into one big ball. I've been scared of it and fascinated by it simultaneously all my life.
Well, and isn't it interesting that, I remember how important the X-Files was for me, growing up. And I know a lot of other people felt the same way. It was just like that, the tension, dramatic tension between the two characters, and then all of the, the cattle mutilations and the lights in the forest and creepy creatures and all of that stuff. It was just really something that, I don't know, that really got me going. So and then Close Encounters, and then E.T. Like, I remember watching E.T. and crying in the movie theater, and actually I still cry when I'm a nerd. I'm a total nerd, but it's just those have such, things like that have such an impact on a young mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. For me, it was the original Star Trek. Getting good science fiction on TV was so rare in the 1960s, and then Star Trek came along and just blew the lid off everything. Just did everything new and different they possibly could, and it all worked. And we know what a cultural force Star Trek has been for the last 50 or 60 years. It's just amazing.
No, it absolutely is. It's just I love it. But when you had that fascination from early childhood, how did you decide? How did you decide to actually get into the UFO world?
I don't know if I really decided to.
Okay, good point.
Be honest. When I started writing scripts, they generally were not necessarily science fiction, but they generally had some sort of fantastic aspect to them, whether it was science fiction or something paranormal or what have you. So my writing always tended to, be in that groove right from the start. And then, I got my first break with Star Trek, so that kind of forged it right there. It's like, oh, okay, I'm a science fiction writer now. So I've just gone with that, and I have written plenty of things that aren't science fiction, but I generally always gravitate to that one way or another.
And so when you started, kind of peeling back all of the UFO stuff and looking at the different cases and the different people involved and the different narratives that have been put into, the community, what were your first thoughts when you were looking at things and making your assessment on what you were going to do next?
Ooh, boy. I'm not sure yet, because it's all very nebulous to me. It's like there was never any specific moment or event or time or anything where I just felt like, oh yeah, this is it. it's all just sort of this whole process thing, and you just sort of look up one day and realize, oh, this is what I'm doing. This is kind of cool. Early memories, of course, were from, and I've been talking about this in my podcast. I have a lot of early memories, formative memories of growing up, watching, certain very specific TV shows and very specific movies. We had grandparents who lived in Iowa, and we would go out to Iowa like once a month. And for some reason, in Iowa, they could get all the big Chicago TV stations that we couldn't get in Wisconsin. And the Chicago stations played tons and tons of monster movies and science fiction movies. So my weekends at Grandma and Grandpa's were always like, don't bother me, I'm in front of the TV all weekend. That was basically all I was ever interested in.
How fun. And so was there, and I know, there was no specific, moment. Like for me, I had some interesting things happen, and that was just like, that kind of pushed me into it publicly. But when you first started hearing about UFO cases and things, were there some UFO cases that stuck out to you?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There was a case in 1973 that I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be familiar with. It was the alien abduction of Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker in Pascagoula, Mississippi. It took place in October 1973, so I was 13 years old. And up to that point, I had been very aware of UFOs. I had been reading any kind of book or magazine I could ever find about UFOs. But that particular case, that abduction case, made national news for days and days and days. It wasn't just a flash in the pan. It was national news for a long time. It was being reported in the TV news, the radio news, the newspapers. And that really had a huge impression on me because it was the first time that I felt like, oh, this is really happening in real time. This just happened like 2-3 days ago, that these guys were taken aboard a flying saucer or something, a flying egg, by these weird robotic creatures and subject to medical examinations. This really just happened. And that has such a huge effect on me. Just the fact that it was like this real-time UFO event just blew me away.
And in what the early 70s, that was a really interesting, time frame for all of that. And then you had, the National Enquirer and different outlets that were, reporting things. And then you had, the early 70s with the cattle mutilations and all of this type of thing taking place. And so who did you, when you came into the UFO world, who were some of the people that you initially looked up to?
Erica, can we just put this on hold for a second? I think I need the dogs out. Is that okay?
Oh, you need to take the dogs out?
Yes. I'll be back. Just give me 2 minutes, okay?
Absolutely. Oh, no, that is the best thing I've heard all day. No, absolutely. The dogs are good. So anyway, just to let you guys know, when I was in, I was growing up, I had some pictures and I posted them on social media, and I'll have to do it again, but I was fascinated, back in the 70s with a couple different cases. And I found, and you might have heard me talk about this, but when I was thumbing through all of my school papers that my grandmother kept, I found a couple years ago 2 of the drawings that I submitted back in the 2nd and 3rd grade, I believe. And there was the Charles Hickson, the alien, and he was looking at this little teeny ant lying on its back, and I was, the little zapping thing coming out of its eyes, and the ant is saying help. And then I also drew the cover of the Dale White book as something up there. And so those were 2 of my childhood memories that were so interesting to me that I actually have. And again, I'll post those on Twitter just so you can get a laugh out of that. And then I also found in that stack of papers some poems that I had written in grade school, and one was about this fiery ball of light that was moving through the forest, and that was very interesting. So there were some childhood, moments where all of my nerdness, my love of the unknown was coming through. And I think it's fascinating. And it's fascinating to hear Mark talk about all of the experiences that he had that sparked him. And I know all of you do too. And thank you, Peter. You just said you love my alien drawings and mind control. That's right, with the ant. There's a little bit of mind MK Ultra going on there. I didn't even know about it. But I love that. And Mark wrote a book, and I don't know if any of you, and hopefully you guys have read this, but this book is really incredible, and it's called The Close Encounters Man, How One Man Made the World Believe in UFOs. And this is a book specifically about J. Allen Hynek, who was the astronomer who invented the concept of close encounters with alien life. And he also was one of the inspirations for Steven Spielberg's blockbuster classic. And then there was also a TV series that I was just on for one season on the History Channel that came out, and this must have been a couple years ago, but it was called Project Blue Book. And when that came out, it was about J. Allen Hynek. That was very controversial because they portrayed Hynek in a way that was very, well, I'm not quite sure how close to reality that was. They also took some of Hynek's work and then added that little fictional spin on things, which I thought it was an entertaining show and I enjoyed watching it. But some of the diehards in the UFO world are pretty upset about the way that the show misrepresented the actual work of Hynek. And so I think that is, all of that is just fascinating. And I'm not sure if Mark's back from his dog.
I am.
Okay, sweet. you made me, yeah.
I was afraid you could hear them whining at the door.
No, that's cute. That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so you wrote The Close Encounters Man, and you decided to really dig into Hynek, and Hynek was a very interesting person in the subject, and still is. And now I was just mentioning, the show that came out, and the fact that there were some facts about him that have been, there's a lot of creative liberty there.
Yeah.
As you know. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I want to, how did you get involved? Why Hynek?
Well, I had started writing my UFO blog, High Strangeness, about 10 years ago. And I just got into the habit of just browsing the internet, like almost on a daily basis, looking for interesting UFO stories to write about in my blog. And one day I came across the website for CUFOS, the Center for UFO Studies, which had been founded by Allen Hynek back in the 70s. And they still seem to exist. They had a functioning website with a phone number and an address, and I was kind of floored by that. I had no idea it still existed. So I contacted the current director, Mark Rodiger, and asked if I could come over. I was living in Chicago at the time. The CUFOS archives were in Chicago. So I started visiting there every couple of months just to sort of look for story ideas in all their files. And one of the times I was there, Mark said, I've been writing your blog and I enjoy your writing. He said, we've always wanted to find someone to write the definitive account of Dr. Hynek's career, and I wonder if you'd be interested. And that's how it happened. I said, of course I'm interested. What an incredible opportunity. And it just worked out so beautifully, Erica, because so CUFOS is not what it used to be. They don't have a permanent building. They don't have an address. Their files are stored in different basements and different storage facilities in different parts of the country. But I kept going back and researching Hynek's life because the main archives were just a couple of miles from where I lived. Well, then it turned out Hynek had also gone to college at the University of Chicago. I was just a couple of miles away too. And then it turned out that Hynek had also taught for many years at Northwestern University, which was also just a couple of miles away from where I lived. So I had this trifecta of Hynek's personal and career records all within a couple mile radius of where I lived in Chicago. It was like it was so perfect. It was like it was all being handed to me. So that's how it all got started.
I love that, because you actually got a chance to go where most people have not been.
Yeah, and believe me, I felt very privileged. I still do. I got access to some really wonderful people and some really amazing materials that just don't really see the light of day. And I decided early on in the book that if I was really going to do it right, I wanted to get different voices in. I didn't want it to be just another UFO book. I didn't want to quote the same people that are quoted in all the other books. I wanted to find new voices, people who had never been asked about their UFO work. And I got pretty lucky. Two of the most amazing people I interviewed one was William Powell, who had worked for Hynek in the 50s when Hynek was really, really getting entrenched. I'm sorry, it was in the 60s for Bill Powell, when Hynek was really, really getting, entrenched in UFO world as the go-to guy. And Bill Powers had some amazing stories to tell about working side by side with Dr. Hynek. And then there was this woman, Jenny Zeidman, who had started out as Hynek's teaching assistant at Ohio State and then became his co-investigator, his investigating assistant for Project Blue Book in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And I was lucky enough to get interviews with both of them, and they both told me, I'll have to back up a little. Bill Powers was fantastic, told me a lot of great stories. The first time I tried calling Jenny Zeidman, she hung up on me. That was kind of a shock. It took me a while to recover. And so the phone goes dead, and I'm sitting there thinking, well, do I call her back and try again, or do I just leave it be? And I decided to leave it be. But she had already told me before she hung up, she said, look, I've already written about a lot of that stuff. You can find it in the MUFON website and archives. And she said, feel free to quote me from anything I wrote back then. So I did that in the book. And then shortly after the book was published, I got an email from Jenny's son saying, hey, my mom would like to get in touch with you. Can I give her your email address? And I said, well, sure. And then I was scared to death, Erica. I did not know.
Yeah, I can see why.
From this talk, well, she emailed me shortly after that and just wrote the most wonderful letter. She just said, congratulations, Mark. You wrote Alan exactly as I remember him, which made me feel so great. That was the best review I'd ever gotten. And then 2 weeks later, she wrote to me again, and she said, hey, I just need to tell you, I just finished reading the book for the second time, and for the second time, I was in tears. So Jenny and I became pen pals. I was lucky enough to get her into the first 3 episodes of UFO Witness, the show I did for the Travel Channel, which for me, that was like the whole point of that show. If I could just get Jenny on camera for even a few minutes to just share some of her stories and her secrets, that made it all worthwhile. So those were the kinds of opportunities that just started coming to me when I started writing the book, and it just never ended.
And so did you talk to Jacques Vallée?
Interesting story. I tried and tried and tried to contact him the whole time I was working on the book. Never, ever succeeded until it was like a couple months before publication when it was really too late for me to do anything about it. Unfortunately, Jacques does not like talking to me because in my book, I reveal that the French ufologist character in the movie Close Encounters, who everybody thinks was based on Jacques Vallée, actually wasn't. He was actually based on another French ufologist named Claude Poher. And I quoted Hynek identifying Poher as the influence in an interview he did back at the time the movie came out. So it's not like something I made up. It's something that Hynek actually said. I simply quoted it in my book, but Jacques has acted as though it was something that I made up and, I was spreading this dirt about him or something. I don't know. It's been very disappointing. So he and I don't talk.
Well, that's certainly interesting. Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah, it's a bit weird. In fact, Spielberg never even met Vallée until the movie was already shot. So that should tell you something right there.
Okay, more fascinating tidbits. Thank you.
Oh yeah, there's lots and lots. There's lots of fascinating tidbits out there.
Well, and it is interesting because you look at some of these people who have been icons in the subject, and the Hal Puthoffs and all of those people, Kit Greens, and the people that have been around kind of steering the waters and the narrative for a long time. And it is interesting to maybe uncover some things about that, and maybe liberties that have been taken.
Well, I can tell you, just from my point of view, I can only speak for myself, but when you're researching somebody's life to write a biography, when you come across that sort of surprise, you got to put it in the book. And that happened multiple times with me in the book. I would come across something that just went against everything that I thought I knew about ufology, and I would just think, this is in the book now because this is the truth, and I need to sort of try to, correct the record and make sure people understand what really happened. That happened several times, and you can't just sit there and think, gee, if I put this in the book, it might hurt somebody's feelings. That's there's no point in doing that, I don't think. I just felt like, no, this is what the truth is of this story, and I need to put that in the book.
Well, thank you, because I think a lot of people in the UFO subject, it's about, who's hurting this person's feelings and who's doing that. No, we can't possibly question people and hold people accountable for making statements that aren't necessarily true. And it has been, really interesting to see, especially, with some of the recent things that we'll definitely talk about on the second half of the show. But to see how there are people that are such, blind followers that they act like pit bulls, and then they go out and attack people for just asking a logical question. Yeah,
I agree. It's very disheartening.
It is. And so what other, because now you got me totally intrigued, what other discoveries did you make in the process of your research that kind of took you aback for a bit?
I can think of a couple that spring to mind immediately. One of them was the whole swamp gas incident, the 1966 Southern Michigan swamp gas case. People have condemned Hynek for years over the role he played in that whole mess. And when I really started doing some research, and honestly, I didn't have to research it that hard before I could uncover the timeline, it's very easy to see that most of what has ever been written about Hynek, about the swamp gas case, is totally wrong. In my opinion, Hynek actually said exactly the right thing in his press conference, because all he said was these people may have seen swamp gas. He didn't say they did see swamp gas. He said they may have seen. He said what they're describing sounds like swamp gas, which is true. There's nothing wrong with what Hynek said, and yet he's been condemned for decades for having supposedly, protected the Air Force, covered the Air Force's ass on the swamp gas case. So that was a big one. Another big one, and this doesn't have anything to do with Hynek actually, is about Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan and Hynek had a very interesting relationship. I wouldn't call them friends, but they were colleagues. They worked together on some projects. They butted heads on a lot of things. But when I really started looking into Carl Sagan, who I've always loved and admired, I found out that Carl Sagan was really a prize jerk. He was horrible to Hynek. He was horrible to anyone who had the slightest interest in UFOs. And he could be a really mean SOB. He was really good at insults. And he skewered Hynek many, many times. And I hate to say it, but I lost an immense amount of respect for Carl Sagan while writing my book. He has a lot to be proud of. He accomplished a lot in his career, but just as a person, he was not always a very nice person. I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, that's too bad. It is sad when you start to look at things and you get this kind of behind the scenes perspective of people, and you just say, God, everything I thought about this person is just simply not accurate. And you brought up, Carl Sagan, and I'm just going to throw this out there, and I'll maybe discuss this on a future show. But I remember when I was doing research into Joe Firmage, there was a Joe Firmage connection with Carl Sagan's widow, which I'm dangling that little carrot out there so you people think about it.
Uh,
Yeah,
Stick in.
yeah. Very
Stick.
interesting.
Well, here's the thing about Carl Sagan. This was one of the first things I discovered while looking through the Ufos files. I got to the letter S, and I found one folder labeled Sagan and another folder labeled Spielberg, and those were the two most exciting finds, I think, early on in the research. And the file folder labeled Sagan, I open it up, and at the very top of the pile in this file folder is a copy of a letter that Dr. Hynek had mailed to Dr. Sagan back in, I believe, around 1980. They were due to appear together at a Futurism conference in Chicago, and Hynek wrote this letter to Carl Sagan saying, "Hey, can we please just call a truce just for this one event? Can we just stay away from the topic of UFOs and just, have a polite and thoughtful conversation? Could we please do that?" And I thought that letter was quite amazing. He's basically asking for a truce. He's trying to call a truce for this public event. And so, of course, I looked through the rest of the pile looking to see where Carl Sagan wrote back. Well, I never found any trace of a return letter from Carl Sagan. And when I finally tracked down notes from this Futurism conference they attended, it was clear that Sagan completely ignored Dr. Hynek's request to call a truce. At this conference, Dr. Sagan and Dr. Hynek were on stage together talking about, life, extraterrestrial intelligence, and Sagan was just brutal. He was just insulting and sarcastic to Dr. Hynek, just never cut him a break. It was really a very, very disappointing thing to read. But that kind of told the story of Carl Sagan. And it's crazy because, as many of your listeners I'm sure will know, Carl Sagan has always believed. He had always believed in the existence of other life forms out there in the galaxy and in the universe. He always believed that was true. And he also believed that alien beings probably visited Earth. But he always said, but that would have happened millions of years ago. Anybody who thinks they're still coming to visit us now is crazy. What a double standard. What a ridiculous double standard. But that's what he stood for.
That is a little bizarre.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
And, and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, which we all know about, their headquarters building is actually named after Carl Sagan. So he was a huge, huge champion of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. He just didn't believe that they were coming to see us now. I'll never be able to figure that out.
That is really bizarre, actually. But, I guess when you roll in this subject, you come to expect things like that, I suppose.
Yeah, weirdness happens.
It does. And so what other, before we go to break, because we've got about 6 minutes left, but what other things like that did you discover? Because this is, to me, I think that the story of different personalities and the way they behaved behind the scenes is really important for people to understand.
Well, one big surprise for me was to learn that Dr. Hynek was deeply fascinated by the occult. His son Paul told me about how his dad would take him to these, I can't remember what he called them. I think it was a hypnotism conference, a conference for hypnotists. But they would meet all these really interesting people, like I think his name is Robert Monroe, the man who popularized the concept of the out-of-body experience. Mm-hmm. Dr. Hynek was really interested in all this stuff, and he would go to these gatherings and try to learn more about them. Of course, he was pretty hush-hush about it among his scientific colleagues, naturally. But he had a really, really deep interest in it. I found that very fascinating. And even though he never talked about it, he had a very deep spiritual side to him too. It's very similar to my spiritual views in that I believe there is a greater power than us. I just don't know what it is, and I don't really need to know. Just knowing that it's there is enough for me. Hynek was kind of along those lines too. That's where his thinking went. So I really appreciated learning that about him. I thought that made him much, much more human.
And that's interesting because, when you look at Jacques Vallée's, interests, and you read his journals, and obviously he, dabbled in a lot of different things as well. Were they, they were close friends. Am I wrong about that?
No, you're not wrong at all. They were very, very close friends. They were very tight for many, many years. And they both, yes, you're right, they both shared that interest in, well, specifically the Rosicrucians. They were both very fascinated, and they had both done some studying on the beliefs of the Rosicrucians. And I don't know if Vallée still pursues that at all. I haven't really heard him remark about it any time lately. But yeah, back in the day, it came out, and I tell this story in my book. They were headed to Colorado to testify to the Condon Committee at the University of Colorado. So this would have been late 60s, like 1967, 68, somewhere in there. And they were driving to their hotel from the airport, and they got into this philosophical discussion, and they both kind of reluctantly admitted to each other that, oh yeah, I'm kind of interested in the Rosicrucians. It's a very, very interesting conversation between these two really hard-boiled scientists.
And what about Scientology? Did you ever have any interest in that?
I never came across any indication of that.
Okay.
And I have to say, I'm glad I never did.
That's probably true. That's an interesting look for some people. But oh, Lord. And so, when you talk to Paul Hynek, that must have been, he seems like a really interesting and a very nice person. That must have been very cool.
It was. Paul had a lot of really fun stories about their home life, which I appreciated. I was able to use a few of those stories in the book, and I was very grateful to that. They had an interesting family, though, because Dr. Hynek's first three children were all born in the 1940s, and then much later in life, he had two more kids, Paul, and I think Ross is the other one who came later in life, and they were both born in the early 1960s. So Paul was able to tell me a lot about his dad's later life, but not so much about the early stuff, because obviously he wasn't alive for that. But no complaints. Like I said, Paul shared some really fun, really, really heartfelt stories about their family life. He and his siblings, they knew they were living in kind of an oddball house. And they seem to take great pride in that, which I really appreciated.
And so how did you ever talk to them to find out how they viewed the History Channel's presentation of, the wild and crazy swinging sex life of...
Brother.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Because that was that was definitely an interesting angle of the show.
Yeah. Well, I have to be careful what I say here because I really appreciated Paul's contributions to my book. I'll always be grateful to him for that. He did end up signing on as a consultant to that show, and I do not understand the thinking behind that. I really can't imagine, and I don't even want to speculate. But I know Paul and his brother Joel were both signed on as advisors on the show. But yeah, the show was very, very far from the truth.
Then that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it was. That was. It was entertaining. Like I said, And do you know why it didn't get picked up for a second season?
Well, it did get picked up for a second. It didn't get picked up for a third season.
Oh, okay.
So,
well,
they did go a second season. I don't really know the thinking behind. Obviously the bottom line is it just wasn't getting the ratings in the second season. I didn't watch the show. I only saw maybe an episode and a half altogether because I was so disgusted with it. I had just spent 5 years of my life trying to tell the true story of this man, and then this TV show appears out of nowhere and just throws the true story out in the trash and just makes up a whole new narrative. I was thoroughly disgusted and offended. I actually got one of the programming vice presidents at the History Channel got pissed off at me and started sending me angry emails. That was a trip. So yeah, if we're going to talk about that show, I'm I don't have a whole lot of good things to say about it.
Well, it's a great point. You did want to represent. You are, and you have represented very factual portrayal of his life. And so that is interesting when something like that happens, and then you see history being rewritten. And for me, that's been kind of one of my little hot buttons, because I see, especially right now, when you've got so many of the great people that have contributed to the field, and have gone behind the scenes because they think ufology is a complete sham, quote unquote ufology. But, I know that a lot of them are worried about how they will be remembered, how their work, the history of this subject, what will happen to that now that you've got these new people popping up on YouTube who are promoting things that they honestly don't really know about, maybe they don't care about. I know Barry Greenwood had mentioned to me in a conversation that there was actually somebody online that was saying, the old ufologists or researchers should just die and go away. And it's like, okay, Mr. whoever you are that clearly needs psychological counseling and to, get out of the sandbox. It's like, God, if you're not willing to learn from history and you can't put out facts and then understand that this subject is one of the most manipulated subjects on the planet, then there's a problem. Yeah. And I've been attacked now and again. As I know you're aware of, and it's pretty hard to avoid. Boy, I just don't know where to go with that. There are so many things that can be said. It's all very dispiriting and disheartening. For me, I'll tell you one thing: the absolute low point for me just came a couple days ago when I saw these messages on UFO Twitter about, I don't know who the person is, I don't remember the name, but somebody had taken the words of Luis Elizondo and set them to music. And I nearly gagged when I read that. That is such out-of-hand hero worship. I am sorry, Luis Elizondo set to music? Where do you go from there? I just don't even know where you go from there. I'm so disheartened by all of this. Where you go from there is you see an animation of Jeremy Corbell half naked breaking an alien's neck. That's where you go. I'm so glad I haven't seen that. Oh, God, yeah. So that's, wow. Okay, well, maybe I'll probably see it at some point, I'm sure. But yeah, it's really sad. And, the things that people are willing to pick fights over is also just kind of sad. It's like, well, I'm entitled to my opinion. I know, we started talking about a month ago when Luis Jimenez had his sort of Night of 1,000 Ufologists. And I'd been so disappointed in how that was run because, the number one rule was don't give anyone any shit. And I logged on and there were people giving people shit. And I just was like, this is not what I agreed to. And then I started getting shit for that. So, it's just like, it's so hard to just find some kind of safe, solid ground from which you can have intelligent, thoughtful discussions and share ideas and even argue differences of opinion. It's like, it's so hard to do these days. And in truth, I guess it's always been that way. But it just goes to show you, we've made so little progress. I don't know. And that is just disheartening, and I agree, and I want to get a little bit more into that along with some other things, but we're going to take a break, and I wanted to say thank you. I knew this was going to be a wonderful conversation. I'm glad it's finally taking place, and I would definitely just recommend for everybody to go out and get The Close Encounters Man, How One Man Made the World Believe in UFOs. You can find that on Amazon. And then your blog. Tell everybody where to find your blog and then your new podcast. The blog is High Strangeness USA. That's all one word, highstrangenessusa.com. The podcast, which it's somewhat about UFOs, but it's more about my writing career. So I just want to be clear about that with everyone. The podcast is called Far-Fetched, FAR-FETCHED, and it's on Apple Podcasts. And it's on Spotify, and it's on Google, and all sorts of places. So I'm about awesome. 5 episodes. I just posted episode number 5 today, so I'm having fun with it. I'm very excited about it. That is so awesome. And thank you for being here. We're going to take about a 4-minute break. And I want to tell everybody out there listening, thank you for supporting the show. I really appreciate it. I do this on my own dime, and I don't have advertisers. And I'm doing this because I'm committed to getting the truth out there, and I'm committed to preserving history. And you know about my wonderful archive. So go to UFO Classified and pledge your support for the show, because it means a lot to me, and it helps get the truth out there. And Lord knows it doesn't pay for my therapy, but that's okay. That's good. So we are going to take a quick break. We will be right back with Mark O'Connell. Thank you. The show. So welcome back to UFO Classified. This is the second half. You can go to ufoclassified.com to pledge your support for a show that needs to be out there, because there is so much nonsense going on right now. And I can't help but just stress the point that what is taking place in ufology right now, guess what, you guys? It has nothing to do with the true, UFOs. It just isn't. This is all a political ploy. These are all people that are talking about patriots and Annie, get your gun, and hey, we're gonna, stir up the narrative and break, aliens' necks half naked. That's really not a hot look. Let me just say that much. And also, create this distrust in the government and all of this stuff. I mean, talk about QAnon. Let's give me a break, people. Let's just get over that, and let's get back to looking at the real, some of the amazing cases, to looking at the people that are integral in preserving history. And we've got to do our due diligence to make sure that the history is told correctly, and none of this garbage that we're seeing. Because, here we've got, again, the resurgence of the MJ-12 documents. All of this crap that has been debunked time and time again, but yet this new generation is just going to jump off the bandwagon. And no, we don't have little gray brother hanging out at Area 51. Let's get a clue. Anyway, thank you for letting me vent. I feel much better. That was great. But anyway, I'm back. Did you like that? I feel like a holy roller. I don't know.
Yes. I appreciated it.
Yes, well, thank you very much. And I'm back with Mark O'Connell, who is an amazing screenwriter. He wrote a book he did extensive research on Hynek, and the book is The Close Encounters Man, How One Man Made the World Believe in UFOs. And we were talking a little bit about, before we went to break, some of your, feelings of frustration that I definitely feel too when you see the current state of what's taking place. And so tell us what your thoughts are when you see what's taking place with, Elizondo and TTSA.
Well, I can just say, before I get too specific on those two, I want to share something that I've been thinking about a lot over the last few days, and that is that how in any conversation about UFOs, whenever certain phrases or terms come up, like the word tech or intelligence community, whenever words like that show up in a UFO conversation, I immediately lose interest. I don't know if anybody else is like that. Maybe it's just me, but I immediately lose interest in the conversation, because I feel like you're veering off into a world that I couldn't care less about. I don't care. See, for me, I have felt very certain since a very early age that there's a fundamental reality to the UFO phenomenon, right? That belief has always been there. It's never been shaken. And because my belief is so strong, I don't really care what the Air Force says. I don't care what the government says. I don't care what they know or don't know. I don't care what they have in their possession or don't have in their possession. It doesn't change my feelings about this phenomenon at all. I still believe it's real. I still believe it would be really fun to find out what that reality is. I know we may never find out, but I think it's incredibly fascinating and entertaining. And I don't need to obsess over government committees and secret documents and, Wilson papers and any of that crap. I don't need it. I don't need that to be part of my UFO beliefs. Other people need it, fine, but I don't at all. As far as your more specific question about To the Stars Academy and Luis Elizondo, and by the way, I just want to say here officially, Erica, I will always only call him Luis Elizondo. There was this very weird thing that happened shortly after this guy came on the scene where, like, overnight, everybody writing about UFOs switched from calling him Luis Elizondo to Lou Elizondo. Like, suddenly, every UFO writer had become his best friend. And I thought, that is propaganda at work. Right there. Bingo. So, I will tell you about my experience with Luis Elizondo. I saw him speak at the UAP conference in Huntsville, Alabama, about 2 years ago, which was a really great conference. I had so many great visits with so many fascinating people who, and this was the kind of thing we should have more of, exchanging ideas, sometimes disagreeing on things, but always showing mutual respect. So Luis Elizondo gets up to give a talk at this event, and it was the most manipulative operation I have ever been witness to. Here's what he did. He got up and he started telling us about how, you guys, we have so much exciting stuff to show you. We're making so many exciting discoveries. We just can't wait to share all our discoveries with you. So he'd get the crowd worked up and, to this sense of excitement and anticipation. And then somebody in the audience would raise their hand and say, well, when are you going to reveal it? When are you going to reveal it? And Elizondo would do a complete 180 and say, now, wait a minute, guys, slow down. Be patient. We can't do this stuff overnight. Give us a break. And I just sat there thinking, you just got them excited, and now you're pouring cold water on their excitement. How manipulative can you get? And I have to give Elizondo credit. He's very good at this manipulation. He's very good at it. Very skilled. He was working that crowd like a magician. But I was thoroughly disgusted, and I've never seen him say or do anything since then that has changed my opinion about him. Sad to say.
Well, and it's interesting because he comes across, here's the tough military guy, and I'm sacrificing so much to bring this information out to the public, and I'm being crucified and yada yada yada, and it's just like, Kate, let's talk about people like us who have actually really tried to do that, and we have been berated by a group of trolls that in all likelihood originate probably from that same group. Mm-hmm. That's my own personal thing. I mean, it's like, it's funny to see this, oh, poor me, and get behind me, and, blah, blah, blah. And then you mentioned, the stuff on UFO Twitter and how these people are saying we can't treat other people like this, and yet they're the first people engaging in behavior that is really reprehensible and doesn't do much for the credibility of the subject.
Yeah, and meanwhile, you mentioned, Elizondo's message. Well, what does the guy actually have to say? All I ever hear him saying over and over again is, these things are real, folks. And every time I hear him say that, I'm like, well, wow, thanks for getting us all up to speed there, Louise. Like, we didn't know that? We needed you to tell us that? Come on. And that's basically all I ever hear the guy saying. Maybe I'm missing something, but that's all I hear saying. And one more, since I'm on a roll now, Erica, I'm just going to go a little further, okay? Because this is something you and I have talked about a little, I think. So now we've got UFO spokespeople appearing on, what's that jerk on Fox News?
Tucker Carlson.
Tucker Carlson. We've got UFO people appearing on the Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson is an avowed white supremacist. And UFO people think it's okay to go on his show because he'll give them a platform and a microphone. I don't agree. And then you still have people going on Joe Rogan's show. Joe Rogan, just a week or two, was telling people don't wear a mask. And people are still, UFO people just flock to his show because they want to get the exposure and the attention. I think it's really pretty awful if we have to stoop that low, if you have to stoop that low to get visibility for the UFO cause, if that's what we're calling it now. I just think I think you've sunk pretty low.
And I absolutely agree with you. And I've, for a while I'm sitting back and watching people and, where they get their start, who's giving, who's buddy and who's promoting this narrative, which is absolute crap. And, you know, I mean, hey, high five and yo, bro, and hey, we're patriots. And I mean, using some of these they're dog whistles. They are racist dog whistles. And the fact that you know, I mean, it's like, what does that have to do with the UFO subject? And then you go back and you look at different organizations and people involved, and you look at the fact that this has very clearly for decades been a safe haven for people that are, you know, I mean, obviously a brick short of a load, and promoting really racist ideology. And nothing can scream that more than some of the things that people in MUFON, key positions of MUFON, have stated. And there's, you know, hey, that's groovy. We're white supremacists, but hey, let's go storm the Capitol. That's even better. Let's go make sure we do that. And then we're going to use the UFO narrative. And to me, that is very clearly what we are seeing with this group of people, and that is alarming. And they, you know, I mean, it's I had asked in one Twitter exchange Jeremy Corbell, you know, just something, because he had mentioned, you know, the storming of the Capitol. There was something, and I need to refresh my memory so I can get this correctly. And I just said, is that something that you would support? And, you know, basically the answer was yes.
Ooh.
And, you know, it's like, okay, I mean, what? If we aren't, if we don't just, you know, stand up and do something about this, then there's a real problem. Because, as you know, the people that are attracted to the UFO subject sometimes are, maybe gullible.
Oh, maybe.
I was trying to be tactful there.
We can use that word.
What word would you use?
Gullible. Open to suggestion. Is that a better way to say it?
Yeah, that's very nice. That's good.
We know what we're talking about. I mean, you're making all sorts of really good points. I don't understand how a person can say, I desperately want to come into contact with an alien life form, and that very same person actively hates and persecutes half the population of our own planet. I'm getting a headache. I'm getting a headache just from thinking about it. How is that possible? How is it possible for people who are just desperately trying to make contact with extraterrestrials, while at the same time, you know, dumping on their fellow Earthlings who they don't consider to be their equal? It's disgusting.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's sad, because we are, I know that when I was on the lecture circuit and things, I mean, you go to these conferences and people this is all about love and unity and light. And, you know, we are so evolved. We are talking to space beings and, you know, all of this stuff. And then you think, okay, and you're listening to a lecture from somebody that is, holding Adolf Hitler up to a gold standard.
Yeah.
And it's like, I mean, wow, very interesting.
Well, luckily, there are still some positives in the UFO community. We talked about that a little earlier. There's one group of people who I refer to as the UFO Council of Elders that I got connected to back when I was first starting to research my book. It turned out that a lot of CUFOS's files and resources were actually being taken care of by a gentleman in Michigan named Michael Swords. And Michael and some of his colleagues have written an incredible book called UFOs in Government. It's the most thoroughly researched book about UFOs I think I have ever seen. And Michael, he doesn't do it so much anymore, but Michael tries to have these regular get-togethers in Michigan, where he lives, where he invites the Council of Elders, and they all just spend the weekend, you know, eating takeout pizza and swapping stories and sharing theories and ideas about the UFO phenomenon. And I've been fortunate enough to attend a couple of these gatherings, and they're fantastic, because these guys have no egos, they have nothing to prove. They respect each other immensely. They love each other. I mean, there's just total affection between all these people. They're so fond of each other. And they have really fascinating discussions about UFO stuff. And I feel really honored that I've been, sort of allowed to be sort of a junior member. That's been a really great thing. I can also tell you a really great story I'm thinking of right now, just because I want to get this badness out of my head, at least for a few minutes. A couple of years ago, Michigan MUFON invited me to Ann Arbor to give a presentation on the swamp gas. It was the 50th anniversary of the swamp gas case, 2016. And I was thrilled to be invited, but I knew I'd be taking a risk because I knew that my conclusions about the swamp gas case didn't go along with conventional wisdom, and that I might actually irritate some people by, presenting an alternative view of the case. So I was very nervous when I gave my presentation, but I tried to be as thorough as I could. A lot of the confusion about that case stems from this insistence many people have that Hynek showed up in Michigan and within an hour he was giving a press conference dismissing the sightings as swamp gas. That is so far from the truth, and all it takes is about 10 minutes worth of research to find out that no, Hynek arrived in Michigan on a Tuesday evening, and he gave his press conference at the Detroit Press Club Friday evening. That's 3 days. He showed up on Tuesday. He spent Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday interviewing witnesses, visiting the sightings, visiting the sites where the events took place. And he came to a very reasonable conclusion that these witnesses may have seen swamp gas. So I laid all that out in my presentation. And as I said, I was kind of nervous because I could have sworn I would look out in the audience and I would see some kind of unhappy faces on some of the people out there. But afterwards, several people came up to me and complimented me on the presentation, thanked me for it, and said that I had given them some things to think about. And for me, that was the perfect response to my presentation. It really made me feel good about what had happened that weekend. So, there are still some good things happening. I think maybe we just need to look a little harder for them. I don't know. I don't know what the solution is.
No, and I think you're right. And sometimes that does get it is hard to try to remember that. And I know for me, because I get so bogged down, especially after I did all the research on Skinwalker Ranch and got into some, looking into Bigelow and Co. and things like that. It was a very dark, it is a very dark and a very heavy thing. And, you become kind of colored by, what you're seeing. And when you see that people aren't necessarily genuine like you and I are, it's challenging sometimes. And I know that when I've talked to Barry and Jan Aldrich and people that inspire me, I mean, they talk about the people that have just thrown their hands up and said, okay, I'm done. I'm walking away from this subject. And it does get to be like that unless you refocus yourself like you were doing on the show. Thank you. And then thinking about some of the really cool moments that you've had, because there are, like for me, I mean, I've met the most amazing people. I went over to Norway. I got to hang out with, I've hung out with some people that just blow my mind, that are the most genuine, kind people on the planet. And I've got to just share this story with you really quick, because this is a really positive thing. But when I went over to Norway, I went over to Hesdalen, and I was, and Hynek was there, and there's an interview with him where he was one of his last interviews where he was saying that this is a living laboratory, that it was really a place worthy of study. And I got to sit there with, Erling Strand, who started this project, 35 years ago. And he is one of the most incredible people I've ever met in my life. And to hear him talk about how, there was this little valley that was besieged with UFO sightings. And these people were, this was so kind of disturbing, off-putting for these people. I mean, they didn't know what to do, and so they turned to the media. And then, the media in turn made fun of them. And then all of these people, I mean, thousands of people descended on this little village and completely destroyed it. And Erling saw this and his colleagues, and they decided to go out there. And I have an interview, I need to put this up again, but Erling was, just like he said, I saw this, and as a scientist, I said that isn't what science is about. We need to get in there, and we need to study this and help these people. And it was like, just to hear him and to see the expression on his face, and then to watch him. I had this really incredible opportunity to go in there in the valley, and he was talking to a group of the people that lived there, and he was doing a UFO lecture and updating them on different things and making them feel like that they were protected, and there was a cohesive environment. And then and I'm sorry I'm rambling about this, but this is just like, this was one of the most beautiful moments of my life. And to see how they have the kids, the college students from the engineering college who are up there climbing mountains with all of this instrumentation, and they are looking at this like, wow, this is so cool. We're using science to collect information and to make a change. And there's nothing, we're not talking about religion. We're not talking about politics. This was just a beautiful discovery process and an empowering thing. And that is the way that should be here. And so that, for me, when I'm getting discouraged, that's the moment in time that I just look at and I'm like, wow, that is what this should be about.
That's a fantastic story. I'm really glad I heard that. Thank you. So did you actually see the lights?
I didn't see the lights, but I did see the northern lights, and
that's amazing.
Oh God, it was so gorgeous. We literally, every day, every night we would, strap on all of our equipment and climb mountains, and then, sit out in the middle of fields and just sit there and it was, I don't even care if I didn't even see anything. It would have been cool, but it was a neat process. But there were students there that did pick up and film things. And so that was fun. And it was just a really unique opportunity to sit there and learn. And another little story, and I'm sorry, this is your interview, and here I'm going. I'm not usually quite this babbly, but tonight's the night. But we were sitting at a table, and there was a French scientist, there was a Greek scientist, and then two Italian scientists that have done remarkable work, and then Erling and one of his colleagues from Norway. And I'm sitting there at this table just going, wow, I'm a little out of place, but hey, I'm going to roll with this. Because, Erling had been such a wonderful guest to invite me over there and to teach me things. And the French and Greek scientists kind of leaned over and just said, what exactly do you think you're doing here? I'm like, okay, this is the awkward moment I was hoping wasn't going to happen, but it just did. And I just said, well, I am very sincere in my efforts, and I think that there are people out there that can provide you with getting good information out there and supporting what you do. And maybe that went over like a lead balloon. But it was just really funny though,
God, what a great adventure.
Yeah, it was. I'll have to share some pictures with you and some of the videos. But yeah, it was just, yeah. Anyway, thank you. Thank you for letting me, tell that story. I appreciate it. So and let's get back to Hynek. And I'm so sorry that was so off topic. But, when, with Hynek and his, and tell us, because I think this is really fascinating. What was Hynek doing before he got involved with Blue Book?
He was living a very boring life as a college professor at the Ohio State University. And he seemed fairly content with that. He was a junior professor. He had a good, bright future ahead of him. He had started a family. He was frequently called in by the government to do contract work for a variety of things. One of my favorite stories about that is before he got involved in the Blue Book stuff, he did a series of studies paid for by the Air Force, studies of how stars twinkle, how stars scintillate. And I started reading about this stuff and thinking, okay, how does this fit the Hynek jigsaw puzzle? It doesn't seem to fit at all. Why would the Air Force pay a scientist to study how stars twinkle? Well, it turns out there's a very practical application for this. If a pilot sees a bright light on the horizon and has to make a quick decision as to whether it's an enemy aircraft or just a twinkling star, how can he or she make that determination? So Hynek's study was to find out what differentiates a moving light from a twinkling light and what causes the twinkling. Crazy stuff, but Hynek spent a lot of time studying this very subject, the twinkling of stars, so that military pilots could have a better idea of how to identify potential threats. I found that fascinating. Hynek's life was full of all sorts of crazy stuff like that.
And he was also, I mean, talk about the satellite tracking.
Oh yeah, that's one of my favorite stories. So in the late 1950s, Hynek was well known enough and well respected enough, and this is when he's already been doing the UFO stuff for several years, and it's pretty open about it. So everybody knows he's working for the Project UFO for the government. But he gets recruited by a whole long story behind who's sponsoring it and who's pulling all the levers. But Hynek gets tapped to establish a global satellite tracking network, which nobody has ever done before because nobody has ever launched a satellite before. There's never been an artificial body in orbit to track. So Hynek is basically given a blank sheet of paper and said, come up with something. So he spends a couple of years coming up with this really brilliant tracking system. He establishes 12 observatories around the globe to track the satellite once it's spotted. The trouble is those observatories can't necessarily spot the satellite. So he also recruited teams of amateur astronomers from all around the world to form teams to go out at night with binoculars and telescopes and try to find a man-made satellite as it zooms across the night sky. So those were the two prongs of his system: the volunteer astronomers who would locate the satellite, and then the tracking stations that would then monitor the satellites once they had been, once they'd been identified. And of course, all of this was done on the assumption that we would be tracking American satellites with all this equipment. Well, as we all know, it turned out the Russians launched Sputnik before we even got a rocket off the ground, basically. So suddenly Sputnik is the world's first man-made satellite orbiting the Earth. And luckily, we had the system to track it. So all Hynek's work building this tracking system for an American satellite really paid off hugely when Sputnik was launched, because we were able to study it and observe it every step of the way. And Hynek and his bosses at Cambridge, at Harvard, basically became national celebrities because they were quoted on the news every night saying, it's okay, people, this isn't a bomb, it isn't a missile, they're not attacking us. It's just flying around the Earth beeping every few minutes. That's all it's doing. And this was one of Hynek's first instances of real celebrity. As I said, he was quoted a lot in the news. He was on the cover of Time magazine because he was sort of this voice of reassurance to the American public that even though the Russians had beaten us into space, everything was cool, we're going to fix it.
And so, I mean, did you ever get the impression that maybe Hynek was, that the UFO angle was being used as a cover?
Hynek definitely had his suspicions. He would often talk to people who would say, "Hey, you're the Blue Book guy. What did you think of my report?" And Hynek would say, "Oh, well, tell me, what report are you talking about?" And the person describes his report to Hynek, and Hynek would have to say, "No, I never heard of that. That never crossed my desk." that happened often enough that made Hynek suspicious that somebody at the Air Force was intercepting case reports before they reached the Blue Book office. So the really good cases, or when I say good, of course, I mean the scary cases, the cases that actually concerned the Air Force and would have panicked the public probably, those cases were somehow being siphoned off before they reached Hynek's in basket. So Hynek was always aware that there was funny business going on. To the best of my knowledge, he never figured out exactly what was going on or who was behind it, but he was aware that there were things happening behind the scenes that were being kept away from him.
So let me ask you, with relation to what's taking place currently, what do you think is happening, and could, again, the UFO topic be used as a cover for something else?
Well, there's another Hynek story that concerns Jacques Vallée, in which Hynek's friends used to like to come over to Hynek's house and file his papers, because Hynek was a very messy researcher. So when they knew Hynek would be out of town, they'd stop at the Hynek house and just go up to Hynek's office and just organize his papers and clean up the office. And at one point, Vallée came across a document that suggested, and this was apparently an official U.S. military, U.S. government document, that suggested that the government, possibly the CIA, was looking into using the UFO phenomenon as sort of a distraction, to distract from their own aerial maneuvers, to sort of do a psyops, to sort of desensitize people to seeing strange things in the sky. And Vallée raised a big fuss about it, and Hynek just never really... And all my research showed that Hynek just was kind of dismissive about it. He didn't think it was really a big deal. So I've never been completely sure what to make of that. Hynek did not share Vallée's concern, but at the same time, he never said, no, that's not happening. He just seemed unconcerned, and I've never known what to make of that.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I wonder, there's so much going on now, and you do wonder how propaganda, how psychological operations are being used. And I know that you wrote a blog about propaganda, UFO propaganda. Will you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh my gosh, Erica, I don't remember. I don't remember when I would. Okay. I have not done much on the blog for the last year, so I'm kind of a blank. I would be happy to look it up and talk with you about it next time. Then.
Yeah, no, that would be tons of fun. And so let's go back to, when you were at Ufos, because again, this is like so cool, and it gives people like the behind the scenes, stories that you can't really get. And so I know that Mary Kastner has been kind of behind the scenes and held some of the files for a long time. What was it like, visiting with Mary?
Mary is a really fascinating person. The times I would stop by her house, because she had a whole lot of the Ufos case files stored in her basement. So I spent several days going through her files, doing research there. And almost every time I stopped by, she would be hard at work at her computer doing this incredibly detailed photo analysis of I believe it was the Rex Heflin UFO photos. Mm-hmm. I think I'm getting that right. It was one of those really famous UFO photo cases from early on in like the 60s. And she was doing this very intense research into light levels and optics, and trying to decide if the photos had really been faked or if they were really real. It was incredibly detailed work, and I was always so impressed about it. And she was always very happy to tell me what she was working on that day. And then she would always just kind of laugh and say, well, it'll probably never be published. I don't know if anyone's ever going to be interested. So I don't know where she has ended up with that. I do know that the files were moved out of her house and moved down to, I believe they've gone to New Mexico now. So I haven't had any contact with Mary for a while, but she was always very interesting. I will tell you one funny story about visiting her house, though. Mary had a couple dogs, and they were kind of high-strung, shall we say, dogs. And one of the days I was there, Mary she let me get up into her attic. She had sort of a crawl-in attic in her house. And it turned out there were a whole bunch of records and case files in her attic. So I spent a day with a flashlight in this dark, hot attic, pushing these baker's boxes around, trying to uncover anything that might be of interest. And I finally got done with my work. I put all the boxes back where I'd found them, crawled out of the attic, and went to the door that would take me back down to the main floor of the house. And this mean little dog was outside the door, barking like crazy. Really, like it just wanted to take a chunk out of my leg the minute I opened that door. So I just started calling, Mary, Mary, can you take your dog away? And Mary apparently was somewhere where she couldn't hear me. So I just remember spending a very, very long time waiting for Mary to come to the door and take her dog away so that I could get safely out of her house. Those are the dangers. Those are the dangers UFO researchers face, Erica. It's terrifying.
It sounds very terrifying, and I have heard stories about Mary's dog, so that is so
you
funny.
have?
Oh yeah, that's so funny.
Oh my gosh,
I love that. And I've always wished I could speak with her because she sounds like such an interesting person who's done a lot of work behind the scenes. And again, if hopefully maybe some of that will see the light of day, but I don't know.
Well, I hope so, because I think it's valuable work. Any kind of historical analysis is always worthwhile, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And so I want to ask you, because I have Peter again asking another great question. He wanted to know if you came across any information about Hynek's study of the Betz sphere.
Nope.
Okay.
No, I did not come across the thing. And I'll just mention this since this comes up. So I had some guidelines for what I would talk about in the book, and they were very simple. If Hynek wasn't directly involved, let me rephrase that. If I couldn't find any documentation or record that showed that Hynek was directly involved in investigating the case, then I wouldn't pursue it for the book. I wouldn't research it. So because of that, there are a lot of really wonderful, fantastic, mysterious cases from Hynek's time that I didn't research because I couldn't include them in the book because they didn't pass that test, because I couldn't keep Hynek front and center in the narrative. So my offhand response is that is probably one of those cases that that fell into that category. So I have not researched it, and I wouldn't feel comfortable commenting on it.
Okay, thank you. That is interesting. And so when you as you were digging into Hynek and you were looking at some of the personal correspondence and the cases, and you started to get a good idea of what was going on behind the scenes, how did Hynek's opinion change over the years, or did it?
That's the key question with Dr. Hynek, and that was another thing that drove me to write this book. I was aware, just like with the Michigan swamp gas case, where there was just so much misinformation circulating around that case. There was also a great deal of misinformation circling around why and how and when Hynek, quote, changed his mind, unquote, about UFOs. I mean, this is like taken on mythic proportions. And a lot of people in the UFO community are still angry with Hynek because they felt that by changing his position, he kind of weakened their argument. And it's a complicated thing. He started working for Project Sign, the first UFO study, in 1948. Eventually ended up working for Blue Book a couple of years later, and discovered that no matter how hard he tried to explain away all the cases, there was always this residue of 20% of the cases that he couldn't explain away. That happened when he worked for Project Sign in 1948, and it happened once again with Project Blue Book when he joined Blue Book in around 1952. He's like, wait a minute, it's been 3 years, and this 20% ratio keeps holding up. There's still 20% of these cases that I simply cannot figure out. So that was when Hynek started to change his mind. He didn't change his mind overnight. He didn't wake up and, have a brilliant light bulb going off over his head. But that moment when he saw that there was that consistency in the reports, that was what sort of started to change his mind. And it wasn't really until 1966, the swamp gas case, when Hynek finally, he kind of had a moment of honesty with himself and decided that there's more to this than the Air Force is willing to admit, and I am tired of even though he wasn't covering for the Air Force in the swamp gas case, he was tired of being manipulated by the Air Force and tired of being used by them. And at that point, he kind of, that's what sort of completed the transformation from being a hardcore skeptic at the beginning in the late 1940s to late 1960s being like, you know what? There's something real going on here. It needs to be studied in a scientific way because we need to understand it because it could be very important to us.
Was he hopeful towards, I mean, was he jaded, what was his mindset later in his life,
Glad you asked that, because honestly, as I got closer to the end of his life writing the book, I was starting to get very nervous because I wasn't sure how to end the story. I wasn't sure where to end it or how to end it. And I was worried that the story might end really sadly. And it does. He died of a brain tumor. So it is a sad story, but there are a lot of positives to it. There's this whole thing about how he moved to Arizona from Chicago late in life, hoping to start a new research foundation. Well, that kind of fell apart. That was a huge disappointment. He was kind of swindled by some people who he trusted. That was a huge disappointment. But at the same time, he felt as though, like my book says, the man who made the world believe in UFOs. He felt like he had taken the term and the idea of a UFO and brought it out of the shadows and put it into the mainstream. Okay, and I think there's a quote he made at one point where he said he wants people to be able to talk about UFOs at the dinner table, right? He wants it to just be a totally perfectly normal subject of conversation for anyone who's curious or interested. And I do think he felt at the end of his life that he had accomplished that, and that is not a small accomplishment.
And so what do you think that he would say about some of the things that are taking place now in the subject?
Oh, he'd be very interested, but I also think he would be keeping his cards very close to his chest. I don't think he would be speculating a whole lot. The thing that I really grew to admire about him most of all was that he was a scientist to the core. He only went where the facts led him, and he didn't go one step further than where the facts led him. He trusted the facts, and that guided his UFO research. He would never commit to any one theory about what they are or where they might come from. And on some level, I'm not sure if he even cared. He just wanted to find out what they mean. And I really have always respected him for that. And that's really where he sort of got to at the very end. I quote in the book. I quote something he said. One of his very last interviews around 1985, given to Omni magazine, and he said that if he could have his wishes as to how to live out the rest of his life, he'd want to be at a cabin on the coast of Maine with a fire in the fireplace and plenty of food and drink and a whole bunch of friends swapping UFO stories. That to Hynek was his perfect life at when he was close to dying. And I've always thought that was really a very, very wonderful image.
It is a wonderful image. And that sounds good to me.
Me too. I'd be there. I would be so there.
Well, I would too. And I want to just go back to, and this, the fact that Michael Swords and things, and that group of people that they've done a lot of work behind the scenes, and that's cool that you have become involved with them and you know them. I think that's really awesome, because there are people like that are important to the subject and that sit around and talk about UFOs and do much, do what Hynek probably dreamed of doing later in his life. Yeah. And let me ask you, how did this affect his relationship with his wife?
Unfortunately, I never really found out a whole lot about that. Well, I was, as I mentioned before, I was able to interview Paul Hynek for the book. And, Paul shared a few, stories about their home life. But he didn't really talk much at all about their marriage. I do know that there was kind of an interest, I don't even know if I want to go down this route. I mentioned Hynek's assistant before, Jenny Zeidman. Jenny and Dr. Hynek were always very, very close friends. And Jenny was also very close with Mimi Hynek, Dr. Hynek's wife. So there's this really wonderful story that Jenny wrote about when Hynek was born in 1910 when Halley's Comet was in the sky, and he passed away in 1986, the next time Halley's Comet was in the sky. And he always feared that he would die when Halley's Comet came again. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. But there's a really nice story that Jenny told about how the three of them drove out together into the Arizona desert to get as clear a sky as they could find so that they could get a good view of Halley's Comet. And they did that, and it sounds like it was really a wonderful moment between Alan and his wife and their friend Jenny. And, Alan, he kind of knew that this could be it for him. This could be the end for him. So it's really a very poignant moment.
Wow. That's really incredible. I've got so many questions that are coming to my mind about all of this, and these are such just really incredible moments and candid things. And I think that for me to put out information about somebody who did contribute so much to the subject is really important. And I commend you for your hard work on this. This has just been so cool. And I want to just ask you really quick before we get ready to close the show, again, kind of going back to the current things that are taking place, because it's obviously just been a whirlwind, as we know. What do you make of Fravor and that all of that? I mean, with the things that they're talking about with the no plume and these incredible speeds of the objects that they're observing, and the fact that you have these military pilots that are seeing things. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Boy, you would ask the toughest question of all after you got me all comfortable.
I'm sorry. Dang it.
And loosened up. No, that's funny. Gosh, I deep down, I don't know if this is a conspiracy theory or what, but deep down, I have found this whole chain of events that kicked off with in 2017 with the first New York Times article by Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal, and the announcement of the To the Stars Academy and the appearance of these videos of the Tic Tacs. All three of those things happened within a very short period of time, which I immediately found suspicious. And I've always felt that all of those events and everything leading up to what we're seeing now, it's all been very carefully stage managed. And I can't really give you any more than that. I don't have any facts to go on. I don't have any evidence. I just have this gut feeling that the way things have been handled has been planned. I don't know what the ultimate purpose is. It could just be a gigantic psyops just to psych us all out. I don't really know, but I think anything is possible at this point. I think the most important thing is for people to just sort of temper their expectations. We all know that this report is due out in just a couple of weeks. We don't know what will be in the report. We don't know how much of it will be shared with the public. We don't know how much of it will actually be legit, or if they're just, going to just rehash all the same old crap over and over again. We don't really know. I'm hopeful that there might be some interesting news, something of value in this report, but I'm not holding my breath. I'm hopeful, but pretty cautious.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you very much. I didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but that's it's
okay. It's the question of the hour. I mean, we need to talk about it. So cool.
It is interesting, and it's like I said, I think when all of us sit back and watch some of these things, they do feel very managed and very staged. And so whatever the end game is of that, we will see. But if you could give the listeners some advice on how to move through this subject and really do good work or find reputable sources, what would be your thought?
Oh gosh, there's so little we can be certain of these days. At one point I would have said, well, join MUFON, but I don't really feel like saying that anymore. And there's such an embarrassment of riches as far as UFO material that's available online. I guess my best advice would just be to be curious, to sample as many sources of UFO information as you can, and do what I'm doing here, and go with your gut feeling. If you feel like a certain person or a certain community has gotten a hold of some kind of truth that resonates with you, then go with that. If not, just keep looking. I think that there's. Let me put it this way. For me, I don't really care so much, and you may have picked up on this. I don't really care so much about the question of what are they. The last few years, I've been much more interested in the question of what do they mean. So if I was going to tell you from my heart what I think you should look for, it would be that. It would be look for sources of information that help you understand what it means. I mean, figuring out what it is also important, but I fear that we may never really reach that goal. I fear that we may never understand what they are or where they come from. But if we can try to figure out what they mean to us as individuals and as a species, maybe there's a way to move forward there. I believe there is.
And I really like that, and I think that's it. That's kind of the place that I've been going. It's like, just, this is, I've had personal experiences, and a lot of people that are listening have had experiences, and it's like, I think for me, like, holding that close to my vest and finding that meaning for me is what's important. And I definitely feel that's, what does that mean for me? What does, and I think that's really a beautiful way of putting that.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Thanks for asking the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what's next for you?
I've mentioned my new podcast,
yes.
Far-Fetched. I've been having fun with that, and again, it's about UFOs, but it's really about my writing career, because I've had some really fun, fascinating experiences. I've met some really interesting people, and I love telling stories. You can tell that. So it's really fun to have a podcast and share some of these stories about my background and my life as a writer. And that, as I mentioned, that's called Far-Fetched. I do have a couple other media projects in the works. Unfortunately, none of them is far enough along that I can actually talk about them yet. But if any one or more of these projects come to life and starts moving forward, I will let you know, and I will be very excited, because some of these projects, all these projects really in their own way have some real excitement for me and a real high curiosity level. So I hope to learn some things as I go.
That is so cool. And talk just really quick again. Talk about the TV show.
UFO Witness?
Yes.
Oh, well, UFO Witness came about after I wrote my book. We were in talks with a couple of different producers about film rights, TV rights to the book. None of those came to pass at the time. But there was one company that my agent and I had been in contact with, that I liked their work, and I liked the people at the company. So at one point I called them up and said, hey, you know what? Here's an idea. I have all sorts of material, research material that I collected for the book that I wasn't able to use in the book because it just didn't fit for one reason or another. There wasn't space, or the story didn't involve Hynek enough. But I've got all these great cases and this really cool information. What if we did a show using some of these materials that I couldn't use in the book? So that's what got the conversation started. As the show developed, we ended up with this sort of format where we would look at a historic case, where I would basically do the analysis of the historic case, and then Ben Hansen would compare that to a more contemporary case. It got complicated because I was diagnosed with cancer about a week before the show went into production, which is the crappiest timing imaginable. So I had to take a big step back, and unfortunately, I had to take a smaller role in the production of the show, which was disappointing. But I'm really proud of the show. As I mentioned, for me, one of the big goals was getting Hynek's former colleague, Jenny Zeidman, on camera to talk about her experiences, and we did that. So I'm very, very happy with that. We got some new voices into the conversation. That was my number one goal with the show, and I think we succeeded at that.
And so where can we watch it now?
It is streaming on the Discovery Plus streaming service. I believe it may, and I'll have to check on this. I think if you don't want to subscribe to the streaming service, it's only $5 or $10 a month. But if you don't want to do that, I think the show may still be available on regular old Travel Channel on your cable provider.
Ooh, well, I know what I'm going to be binge watching tonight.
All right.
I know, it's like, you'd think I would just take a night off of UFOs, but never. I don't know.
It's scary.
Well, it probably is a little bit. And I also, we're going to have to talk because I have, with the Androffel files, I have some really cool correspondence between her and Hynek.
Oh, I'd love to see that.
Oh, yeah, so we'll have to talk and stuff. And thank you so much for being here. I knew this was going to be a lot of fun, and I've had positive feedback about you and everything in the chat room, so I love it. So thank you very much.
Very glad to hear that. Thanks. It's been a pleasure, Erica. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm glad we were able to work out all our scheduling difficulties and make this happen. It's been fun.
Yeah, it has been fun, and I look forward to having you back. So you take care of yourself. And
you too.
You guys,
one thing, though?
Yeah.
One thing real quick. You have to send me a picture of your 65 Ford.
Oh, you know it. I
all right.
I will.
Okay.
You were going to totally dig it. I will do that. So thank you very much. And
you're welcome.
I want to thank everybody out there for listening to the show and asking thoughtful questions and being respectful. I love being here every Friday night. This means the world to me, just to have this wonderful community and to try to figure out things together. I mean, this is all of us doing that. I want to also just mention really quickly that unfortunately Tim Beckley, as most of you in the UFO world know, passed away. Tim has been on my show. I actually wrote a bit in one of his books with Tim Schwartz. Tim Schwartz is going to be on in a couple of weeks to talk about the life and times of Tim Beckley, who was just a colorful, vibrant character and was around for a long, long time. So my thoughts and prayers are with all of his colleagues and friends and family this evening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting the show. You can go to UFOclassified.com to pledge your support to help keep me on the air and keep the archiving going. All of that good stuff. Thank you guys. Have a wonderful weekend, and we will catch you next Friday. Bye.
So my skeptical mind, and that's just who I am. My skeptical mind goes to, well, yeah, of course, you've got this guy over here that's logical and reasonable, and you got this guy over here that's wearing a tinfoil hat. Of course the tinfoil hat guy's going to see a lot of stuff, right? He's like imagining it, or he's watched one too many sci-fi movies.
But it's used to help us frame hypotheses for UFO propulsion, power, stealth, weaponry.
Everything that we experience is very positive.
Sometimes the field of ufology has a short memory span.
We didn't know anything about the $22 million back then. We just kind of thought, well, this is, and I think that was the reason why they were looking for military-type people, because in the military, you work with whatever you got, no matter what the situation is, and you just kind of adapt and overcome.
What are you going to do with all this? You can't even take care of your own files and get them put into the current system, but yet you want to go collect other people's things. So what are you going to do with it? Who are you giving all this to?
It just really struck me about how the common thread seemed to be deception, but deception of a human nature. So that's what I started thinking, who would these folks be? I mean, then I started thinking about the intelligence agencies, what role they could play and what would be their motivations for getting involved in ufology?
I'm not saying that because the gimbal is not a rotating flying saucer, that means that all the UFOs are false. Not at all. All I'm doing is I'm looking at this one case, these individual cases, and seeing if there's an explanation for those. So try to, if I could ask people out there listening, don't think that I'm trying to attack your entire beliefs about these things.
Nice to be in orbit.